You finish your work for the day, you sit down on the couch, and within seconds you feel like you shouldn't be there. Not because someone told you to get up, not because there's something urgent waiting, but because some quiet voice in your head says you're wasting time. Even when you're exhausted, even when you earned the rest, you still feel guilty. This isn't about laziness. It's not a character flaw. It's something deeper, something wired into how your brain decides what counts as acceptable behavior. And once you understand it, the guilt starts to make a lot more sense. Let's start with what most people think is happening. The common explanation is that guilt comes from not doing enough. That if you really worked hard, if you really pushed yourself, you'd feel fine resting. The guilt, people assume, is just your conscience telling you the truth. But that doesn't explain why the guilt shows up even after long days. It doesn't explain why you can feel it on weekends, on vacation, even when you're sick. If guilt were simply a measure of effort, it would disappear when effort was given. But it doesn't. So something else is going on. Research into rest and productivity suggests that guilt isn't about what you did or didn't do. It's about what rest represents in your mental model of success. For most people, rest is categorized not as recovery, but as the absence of progress. And if you've internalized the idea that your value is tied to productivity, then rest starts to feel like proof that you're falling behind. Your brain doesn't evaluate rest on its own terms. It evaluates rest against an invisible standard, one you may not have consciously agreed to. That standard says that doing nothing is only okay if everything else is finished. And because nothing is ever truly finished, rest never feels fully earned. This creates a loop. You rest because you're tired. But while resting, your brain scans for unfinished tasks, future worries, things you could be doing. It finds them easily because they're always there. And then it sends you a signal. You shouldn't be here. The guilt isn't coming from the rest itself. It's coming from the comparison your brain is making in the background. Here's what that looks like in real life. You take a lunch break, but you eat quickly and check your phone the whole time. Not because you're expecting something urgent, but because sitting still without input feels wrong. The rest never registers as rest. It registers as time you didn't optimize. Or you finish work at 6, but you don't relax until 9 because you're mentally reviewing what you didn't get done. By the time you give yourself permission to stop, you're too tired to enjoy it. The rest becomes another task you're failing at. Or you try to take a full day off, but you keep thinking about Monday. You keep opening your email. You keep justifying the break by telling yourself you'll be more productive later. You can't rest without turning it into a transaction. The guilt doesn't show up because you're resting wrong. It shows up because rest in your internal logic has to be justified. And justification requires proof that you've done enough. But enough is not a fixed point. It's a feeling. And if you're tired, stressed, or overwhelmed, that feeling never arrives. There's another layer. Guilt around rest often increases when you're most in need of it. This seems backward, but it makes sense when you consider how your brain interprets fatigue. When you're exhausted, your brain knows something is wrong. It tries to solve the problem. And the solution it often lands on is, do more. Not because doing more will help, but because doing more is the behavior that's been reinforced. Rest, by contrast, has often been paired with falling behind, with guilt, with the fear of being seen as weak or uncommitted. So even when rest is the correct response, it doesn't feel like one. This is why the guilt can actually get worse on weekends or during time off. There's no external structure telling you what to do. There's no meeting to attend or deadline to meet. So your brain fills the silence with should. You should be cleaning. You should be learning something. You should be improving. Rest becomes the thing you do only when every other option is exhausted. And by then, you're too depleted to feel good about it. What makes this even harder is that the world around you reinforces the same message. You see people posting about their side projects, their morning routines, their productive weekends. You hear phrases like rise and grind, hustle culture, no days off. Even when these messages aren't directed at you, they shape the background noise of what's considered normal. And in that context, rest starts to look like weakness. It starts to look like you're not committed enough, not driven enough, not serious enough. So the guilt becomes a way of proving to yourself that you care, that you're not giving up, that you're still in the game. But caring doesn't require punishment, and rest is not the opposite of ambition. The truth is, your body doesn't recognize the difference between productive work and performative effort. It doesn't care if you're grinding for a purpose or just grinding because you're afraid to stop. It only registers the energy cost. And when that cost exceeds what you're recovering, the system starts breaking down. This is where the exhaustion comes from. Not from the work itself, but from doing the work while simultaneously fighting the need to stop. You're running two programs at once. One says, keep going. The other says you need to rest. And the conflict between them drains you faster than either one alone. The guilt is part of that conflict. It's the emotional penalty you pay for choosing rest when the other program says you shouldn't. And because the penalty is uncomfortable, you start avoiding rest altogether. You push through, you stay busy, you keep moving, until one day you can't anymore. And even then, the guilt doesn't stop, it just shifts. Now you feel guilty for burning out, for not being able to keep up, for needing more than you think you should. Let's be clear about what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean the guilt is justified. It doesn't mean you actually haven't done enough. And it doesn't mean you need to prove anything before you're allowed to rest. What it means is that your internal measurement system is miscalibrated. It's using a standard that doesn't account for recovery, for limits, or for the fact that human beings are not designed to produce continuously. The guilt you feel isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you've internalized a model of productivity that doesn't include rest as a legitimate part of the process. And once you see that, the guilt doesn't disappear. But it stops feeling like the truth. You start to notice it for what it is: a signal, a habit, a learned response that made sense in a context where rest was scarce and work was survival, but not a reflection of whether you deserve to stop. Rest doesn't need to be earned. It's not a reward for good behavior. It's not something you get only after everything else is handled. It's a requirement, and treating it like anything else is why the exhaustion builds and the guilt never fades. You're not broken for feeling this way. You're responding exactly how you were taught to respond. The system you're living in doesn't value rest. It values output, and you've spent years learning how to survive in that system. But surviving isn't the same as functioning well. And guilt isn't the same as truth. The next time you sit down and feel that pull to get back up, to do something, to justify the pause, just notice it. You don't have to fight it. You don't have to fix it. Just see it. Because once you see it, you also see the choice. The guilt will still be there. The voice will still speak. But you'll know it's not giving you information. It's repeating a pattern. And patterns can be seen. And once seen, they lose some of their power.